Hi, I'm Nick Byrd, and I'm just going to give you the latest update on the Religiosity and Reflection Across Cultures project with Steve Stitch and Justin Sitzma as part of the Experimental Philosophy of Religion project at Hillsdale College with funding from the John Templeton Foundation. So, you're aware that there's this thing called a reflection test. The most famous problem from that test is the bat and the ball problem. It looks like this. It's designed to lure you towards a particular response that you can realize upon reflection is incorrect. There's some criticisms of this problem such as it's the fact that it relies on mathematical reasoning and many other things. I'm happy to talk about that. If you haven't already talked to me about that, I have some papers about that. Um, and there's, I guess, some ongoing work that we're doing to overcome these kinds of issues. In our work, we have used slightly different problems that are less familiar and less mathematical where possible so that we can try to overcome these issues. The test has been a good predictor of better reasoning in various other domains, such as probability, logic, and physics. There's papers showing that it predicts better judgment about economics, about chess, about playing Go, all sorts of stuff. So, in general, this test is one of the fewest item ways of predicting variance in performance on all sorts of reasoning. In a paper with Michalska that we ran in the first wave of the pandemic before vaccines, we found that that test predicted, among other things, religiosity. This is in line with what has been called the analytic atheist effect, even though the effect is often referring to a correlation. I've also found this in philosophers, both in 2014 and in data I collected in 2019 in a paper that's now available in Review of Philosophy and Psychology. In that paper, I also ran some mediation analysis to see if it's just the fact that philosophers have PhDs in philosophy and people who have PhDs in philosophy are more likely to be atheists. That is, I tested the mediation of reflection and atheism on things like their education in philosophy. The correlation was not mediated by whether people had a PhD in philosophy. It was partially, but not entirely, mediated by self-reported, actively open-minded thinking. That is agreement with statements like, I ought to seek out evidence against my beliefs. That's the construct that they're getting at by actively open-minded thinking. In the data set that Justin has that kind of motivated a lot of this research, there was a small but significant relationship between reflection and religiosity across many countries and many people, over 70,000 people, which is perhaps part of the reason why these correlations are as small as they are and as why they are as significant as they are. The point is just that there seems to be some signal in the noise. But this data did rely on the original cognitive reflection test, which had the problems I mentioned earlier, which motivated our project. So we developed a novel reflection test by starting with a bunch of problems, narrowing it down to the problems that seem to most reliably get at a single construct that probably is reflection, and used that test to begin understanding not just how that test predicts people's religiosity, but how it predicts changes in religiosity, in particular, whether it predicts and how it predicts whether people lose their religion since childhood. So the religion that they were raised in, have they lost that religion and lost religion altogether? Does the test predict that? And in the first pilot study we ran, we did find some evidence that getting the correct answer on these reflection tests does seem to predict losing one's religion. When we ran another pilot study on a different platform where we get participants, this time prolific instead of cloud research, we found a similar relationship. I suppose it's bigger in this sample. Then we ran a study where we were looking at people in the US and the UK using both prolific and cloud research, and found the same research, found the same effects or correlation, I should say, or yeah, the same observational relationship between reflection test performance and losing one's religion, what we're calling analytic apostasy. Then we started using Google Ads to recruit people that might be slightly more representative of than only people who take surveys for payment on particular platforms. And that data set revealed a similar relationship across many, many countries. There was some significant variance in the regions, I'm using significant there colloquially, not to refer to a p-value. Here we've broken down people into regions by I think it's like the United Nations taxonomy. And what you can see is that there is significant variance. I think I mentioned this in the last video, but the negative relationship you're seeing there is from the Oceania region, and there's not quite 50 people. There's just less than 50 people in that bucket. And so I'm not sure how much stock to put into that result. If it was, 5 or 10 times that sample size in that particular bucket and that showed that relationship, I think that would be pretty interesting. So we'll see if we can actually end up recruiting that many people from that region, whether it's through Google Ads or some other source. What we've been working on and have completed since our last update is we have got translations from a variety of people who um, are embedded in cultures other than the US or, English speaking, mostly English speaking countries. And we have started collecting data using the translated materials. The first completed study we have is from Spanish speakers from the Americas and Europe. And we're finding some evidence of the relationship, the analytic apostasy effect among Spanish speakers. This time it's a bit more attenuated. So, I mean, that might be in line with some of the evidence from a paper by Gervais et al. I think it was 2018 in Judgment Decision Making, called the fickle analytic atheist effect, where they did not find the analytic atheist relationship in all countries, but they found it in some subset. So not finding it among certain people in certain countries who maybe speak a different language other than the English language where the effect was originally detected is compatible with prior evidence. Although, depending on your view of p-values or other things about statistics, you might wonder if there's ways to reduce measurement error or increase statistical power or both that might reveal whether this is a difficult to detect effect or a null effect. So that's something I suppose we could talk about if you're interested. So in terms of discussion for this update, we have evidence of an analytic apostasy relationship in the US and the UK and many other countries, even when we're controlling for nearly a dozen confounds, like all of those plots that I just showed you were. But in Spanish speakers, the effect was a bit more attenuated. So we're curious to know what we're going to find when we look at other languages and whether we can use reflection experiments to find an actual effect as opposed to just an observational relationship between reflection and religiosity and maybe even apostasy. And we are, or at least I am continually interested in this question about data quality and measurement error, not just with reflection tests, but more generally in all of our data. So I welcome your thoughts on that. Also, anyone who has any thoughts on how to recruit people from people outside the US, people outside of English-speaking countries, China, Israel, and countries like this. We would welcome your input or your collaboration because it turns out sites like Prolific and even methods like Google Ads can't reach as many or even just can't reach all of the people we would want at the scale that we need to test the things that we want. So we'd love to partner with you. So I mentioned experiments, reflection experiments. One thing that I mentioned in the last update is we can try to reduce the need to rely on reflective reasoning by giving people a visualization of an argument that challenges their view, as opposed to relying on them to do the work to reconstruct the argument from a wall of text. And when you reduce that need or that load to do the reflective reasoning required to understand and comprehend whether an argument is valid, you might observe different effects. So you might think that this argument against the existence of God would be less polarizing when you visualize the logic of argument for people than when you do not. That's something I would expect based on some evidence about argument mapping. But if you're familiar with argument mapping and the literature on it, you might realize that there's some controversy about whether we can trust the effects of the limited number of published studies we have about argument mapping. And just to kind of elaborate a bit on this concern about data quality, in a study I ran, it was a pre-register study, and we ran it on multiple different samples to see where we would get the best data. And not only did we observe some differences in data quality, but really almost all of the data quality issues we were finding were from a particular platform. You've probably heard of it. It's called Amazon Mechanical Turk. And this is even when we control for the number of completions that people were required to have to participate and their minimum acceptance rate. So they had to have completed at least 500 tasks and they had to have a minimum acceptance rate of 98%, indicating that these are like top tier performers on the platforms. And even then, there was this kind of rather stark difference between the other platforms and MTurk. That's a preprint on OSF if you want to look it up. Reflection, philosophy, correlation is like the beginning of the title. I'm also interested in understanding what we can do with getting a more ecologically valid way of manipulating reflection. So just like we do in our conferences or in our classrooms or in other settings in philosophy, one of the ways we try to get people to reflect is by asking questions and like, having dialogue, right? Going back to Socratic reflection. And so I and my colleagues have been doing some work developing a platform that can get people to reflect on the particular stimuli or outcome that we're trying to get them to be more reflective about, as opposed to measuring the reflection and then measuring some independent construct and looking at the correlation between them. And we have some evidence that this discussion, especially between people who disagree, can be helpful or can nudge them towards one or the other of two different responses. But the evidence is, I guess, like to me, not conclusive. So I'd like to advance or enhance the design of this particular platform and then use this platform to test questions like, does getting people to reflect about arguments about the existence of God or other religious questions nudge people towards one or the other answers to these questions? So if the analytic atheist correlations suggest are supposed to be causal, then we would expect that people who engage in Socratic reflection about questions about whether or not God exists or other religious questions should be more driven towards like atheist type responses than the opposite, or than some sort of null result. So we'll see if that's something we can observe in the final few months of this project. Here's some of the papers that I may have cited in passing or that are just related to the work in case you're like you were having questions about something that I said that I didn't explain well enough and is buried in a paper. Also, just feel free to ask me any questions when we do the social hour or else some other time if you can't make the social hour. I'm happy to talk at these places, or if you have my email address, obviously just contact me. I'm happy to talk about this stuff. I wish you all well. Bye.